Hello there. I'm here in McKeithen Hall. I want to thank you for tuning in from wherever you are, whenever you are. It's Wednesday afternoon here at Hydenwood. I'm assuming that we'll release this on Sunday morning, but hopefully you'll get to take a look at it at some point. And if you have any questions, just encourage you to email us here at the church, and we'll see if we can do this in sort of a different kind of way. We've got a couple more times together in our Acts seminar to finish up today. We're going to talk about Paul's arrest in Jerusalem, and then next week we'll finish up with Paul's final journey to Rome, as recorded in the last book of Acts, where he is literally taking the gospel of Jesus Christ to the things of the earth, as symbolized by his time in Rome, which at the time was sort of the center hub of the known world in the first century. So just to remind you once again, we're following the outline of Acts that Jesus actually gives way back in Acts chapter 1, when he says, "You shall be my witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea, and to the ends of the earth." Of course, we've been in Jerusalem way back in chapters 1 through 7. We've been in Judea and Samaria in Acts 8 through 12. And then in Acts 12 and following, Paul is engaged in his what are known as his missionary journeys. And today he has finished up his third missionary journey. He has journeyed back to the city of Jerusalem, and we're in Acts chapters 22 through 26. This is one of the larger chunks of material we're gonna talk about in the book of Acts. We could spend a long time on any one component, so this is going to be kind of a quick overview of some of those materials. Objectives that I have as we go through today, to explore a little bit more specifically the charges that they actually laid against the Apostle Paul that led to his arrest, and then to consider a little bit about how Paul's defense before Roman authorities speaks to the importance of a clear understanding of mission, and how Paul's understanding of mission led him to be able to do that. So just to remind you of where we kind of left off in our last time together, Paul traveled to Jerusalem. If you remember, he did that in spite of many different warnings that things were not going to work out very well for him once he got to Jerusalem. In the city, he visits with James, who is the leader of the church in Jerusalem at the time. If you remember, this is Jesus' brother, and is credited with writing the letter of James that is in the back of the New Testament. With James, he talks to the elders about all the wonderful things God was doing among the Gentiles. But then James suggests, he strongly urges Paul to make it absolutely clear to everyone in Jerusalem that he is Jewish. We touched a little bit on the reason for that last week. We're gonna jump a little bit deeper into it today, this morning, this afternoon, whenever you might be watching this. He went to the temple. He was worshiping in the temple when he was accosted by a group of angry Jews, and then he was arrested by Roman authorities in Jerusalem. So we're going to take a little bit deeper look at what was actually going on there. All right, so in Jerusalem, Paul is making a 7-day vow, and we talked a little bit last week about how that was likely some kind of version of the Nazirite vow you read in the Old Testament. It was almost complete when these Jews from Asia show up. Now, this phrase "Jews from Asia" is designed by the author of Acts, Luke, to kind of get our minds thinking about things that we have already come across earlier in the book of Acts. If you remember, on his first missionary journey, one of the places that Paul and Barnabas, or some of the places that Paul and Barnabas carried the gospel to and started new churches, were these cities of Pisidian Antioch, Iconium, Lystra, and Derbe. Okay, and if you look at the map here, you'll see way up here in the upper left-hand corner, this region of the ancient world was known by the Romans as the province of Asia. And so when Luke tells us that these Jews from Asia see Paul worshiping in the temple, he's trying to cue us in to thinking about some of the things that took place when Paul was on his first missionary journey. And if you recall, he actually visited these same cities on his second missionary journey, and even on his third missionary journey, he passed through these cities and paid a visit to the churches in those cities. But if you go all the way back to Acts chapter 13, Paul is in Pisidian Antioch, and there's a little verse in Acts 13:50 that says, "But the Jews incited the devout women of high standing and the leading men of the city, and stirred up persecution against Paul and Barnabas, and drove them out of their region." So what Luke is trying to do in later in Acts is remind us of the Jews in Asia, in Pisidian Antioch, and the trouble they stirred up back then. And now some of them have come to Jerusalem for the festival of Pentecost, and they have seen Paul worshiping in the temple. They accuse Paul of false teaching and defiling the temple. And these are a couple of pretty serious charges, and we're going to take sort of a deeper dive into what was actually going on there. Earlier in Acts chapter 21, Acts 21, 20 and 21, there is actually a description of what was going on among the Jewish community in Jerusalem. If you remember way back to Acts chapter 15, it was determined that a Gentile did not have to convert to Judaism, get circumcised, in order to become a Christian. And so when Paul went back on his second and third missionary journeys, he was trying to reiterate to these Gentile congregations that a Gentile did not have to become a Jew in order to be a Christian. Well, word had kind of floated back to Jerusalem that actually the opposite or something different was taking place. That what Paul was actually doing was telling Jews that they had to give up all of their Jewish traditions in order to become a Christian. And that's reflected in this passage here, where James and the Jerusalem elders are speaking to the Apostle Paul, and they say, "You see, brother, how many thousands of believers there are among the Jews, and they are all zealous for the law." And this word zealous here is actually a technical term, and it actually means are willing to perform acts of violence. All right, so the Jews in Jerusalem are willing to perform acts of violence on behalf of the law. And they have been told about you that you teach that all Jews living among the Gentiles must forsake Moses. And that's a Jewish way of saying everything that's in the Old Testament, what we call the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible. You have to forsake everything in the Hebrew Bible, and you cannot circumcise your children or observe Jewish customs if you're going to be a Christian. Now that is absolutely not what Paul was teaching. All Paul was trying to do was remind Gentiles that they didn't have to become Jewish. He never once told any Jew that they had to give up their Jewish practices in order to become a Christian. But that's not the message that the folks in Jerusalem had gotten. Okay? The second charge that was brought against the Apostle Paul by these Jews from Asia was that he has actually brought Greeks into the temple. And this is actually a much more serious charge. In his commentary on the book of Acts, Bible scholar Ben Witherington writes this: Josephus was actually a contemporary of Jesus and Paul. He was a Jewish historian who lived in and around Jerusalem during the first century and even through the destruction of Jerusalem by the Roman army. So Josephus describes a barricade that separated the court of the Gentiles from the inner court. At regular intervals, there were stone slabs in Greek and Latin warning foreigners not to enter the holy place. In the temple of first century Jerusalem, there were several different courts that different people were allowed to enter. There was an outer court of the Gentiles that anybody could go into. Then you pass through a gate into what was known as the court of women, and any Jew could go into that area of the temple. Then there was another walled section with gates that only Jewish men could enter. And then there was another wall with gates that only the high priest could enter. And there were these markers warning foreigners not to go beyond a certain place in the temple courtyard. And years ago, way back in the 1930s, archaeologists actually discovered one of these just outside the gate of St. Stephen, which was part of the Jerusalem temple. And this is actually written in Greek, and roughly translated, it says, "No foreigner shall enter within the forecourt or balustrade around the sanctuary. Whoever is caught will have only himself to blame for his subsequent death." Okay, so if you were a foreigner, a Gentile, and you passed a certain boundary line in the temple courtyard, you would be executed. And this was actually a Jewish law that the Roman government honored. And if the Jewish leadership brought a foreigner who had crossed this boundary line to the Roman governor for execution, that person would be executed. So Paul has been seized by the Jews, accused of false teaching and defiling the Holy of Holies in the temple. And so then Paul has to defend himself. The Roman tribune is literally dragging Paul back to the barracks to be interrogated when Paul actually addresses the tribune in the Greek language. And in so doing, the tribune realizes he's not actually dealing with who he thought he was dealing. Because the Roman tribune makes a statement asking Paul if he is not the Egyptian assassin. Because in those days, there's actually a historical record of a person from Egypt who came to Jerusalem and led a group of people in assassinating high-level Jewish or members of the Jewish society. Now, this word assassin is kind of interesting. It's the Greek word sikario, and it literally means knife wielder or knife wielders. All right, so this Egyptian recruited Jewish zealots who were extremely opposed to Roman occupation. They would wrap themselves in robes and tunics, and they would hide small daggers inside their robes. They would walk through the streets of Jerusalem, and when they came across a leader of the Jewish community who they believed was compromising the Jewish nation with the Roman Empire, they would secretly stab that person and then disappear into the crowd. Okay, and that's why they were called the knife wielders or the assassins. Okay, this was a real group of people that there's historical evidence that actually existed. Okay, it's interesting to note that in Spanish, the Spanish word for hitman is the word sicario, and you can sort of see how languages can have a way of interrelating with one another. But anyway, Paul addresses the tribune in Greek, and then the tribune actually allows Paul to address the mob in Hebrew. And Paul turns to this angry Jewish rabble and starts speaking to them in Hebrew. The result is the crowd goes very quiet and actually starts to listen to what Paul has to say. But what's really interesting is the fact here that Paul is able to speak in Greek, and because he has such an effect on the tribune, it was very likely a very high quality of Greek. All right, he's able to speak Hebrew in a way that impresses an angry Jewish mob to the point where they quiet down enough to listen to what he's saying. And there is also a very high likelihood that Paul also spoke Latin, because he's going to talk directly to Roman governors later on in this part of Acts. And he probably could speak a fair amount of Aramaic as well. So this just indicates the level of education that the Apostle Paul would have had. So Paul turns to the mob and he starts to talk to them. And he starts talking about his Jewish upbringing, his education, and how he grew up zealous for the law himself. He even talks about how he persecuted the way himself. You know, and we read about that earlier in Acts. Then he tells them about his experience on the road to Damascus, and he talks about his conversion and his baptism and how he was a follower and how he became a follower of Jesus. And the surprising thing is the crowd continues to listen as Paul talks about this. But then Paul gets to the point where he says that Jesus spoke to him and told him that his mission was going to be to go far away to the Gentiles, to the ends of the earth. And at that point, the crowd, the angry Jewish mob, lost their minds, and they erupted in violence. The tribune at that point still believes that the Apostle Paul is instigating all of this trouble. And so he's dragging him to the Roman barracks in order to be flogged, because it was the perception that I think has pretty much proven over the centuries to be a complete misperception, in that flogging, what's the word? I've lost the word.
Physical pain.
Physical pain. Torture, there's the word. That torture actually convinces people to tell the truth. I think what they have determined now is that all torture does is it gets somebody to tell you what you want them to tell you. But he was going to torture Paul to see if he could get at the truth. And at that point, Paul claimed his Roman citizenship. And he asked the Roman tribune, is this something that you can legally do to a Roman citizen? And of course, the tribune starts to panic, because he realizes immediately that it's not. But then there's this interesting exchange between Paul and the Roman tribune. The tribune asked Paul, he says, "It cost me a large sum of money to get my citizenship." Paul said, "But I was born a citizen." Now there was a time where I thought that may have been some kind of code. You know, if somebody claimed to be a Roman citizen, then you make this statement, and then, you know, kind of like the spy movies you used to watch years ago, then the person had to come back with exactly the right response to prove that they were a Roman citizenship. Because, you know, you're living in the ancient world wondering about the Roman Empire, and you have to prove you're a Roman citizen. How do you do that? Well, they actually had these, you know, kind of like the ancient version of a modern passport. They're called dictus. This is actually one that was uncovered by archaeologists. There were several ways you could become a Roman citizen in the ancient world. Of course, you could be born to Roman parents, or parents who were already Roman citizens. You could, if you were in the Roman army and had served with distinction, you could be granted Roman citizenship. You could be given Roman citizenship for some other kind of deed of valor or service to the Roman Empire. It's interesting to know that you could not legally purchase Roman citizenship. And yet this Roman tribune is saying it cost me a large sum of money to get my citizenship. It was possible to pay money and bribe someone to give you Roman citizenship, but it wasn't legal. All right, so this Roman tribune is actually kind of stating here that he has obtained his Roman citizenship illegally. And of course now Paul, as a true and valid Roman citizen, might can do something to make the Roman tribune's life not quite so easy. This dictus here is actually from someone who was granted Roman citizenship because of their service in the Roman army. There's some writing on here in Latin, and that's what that is all about. It's kind of hard to read because of the glare, but that's what this piece of paper is. But there were forms of identification where a person who was a Roman citizen could actually prove their Roman citizenship. There's some speculation about how this all happened. One of the legends is that perhaps Paul's parents had been given Roman citizenship because they had performed some kind of deed or service on behalf of the Roman Empire or the Roman army. And so when Paul was born, he would have automatically become a Roman citizen because his parents were. So then the tribune allows Paul to go before the council in Acts 22 and 23. And when you see the word council here, Luke wants us to think in terms of the Sanhedrin and to kind of reflect back on what happened to Jesus and then what happened to Stephen way back in Acts chapter 7, because these are the same people that now Paul is going to go before. As Paul is addressing this council, he starts out by telling them that he is a Pharisee among Pharisees, and that he is actually standing trial because of his belief in the resurrection. Right now, that causes quite a bit of unrest in the midst of the Sanhedrin. One of the things I think that it's easy to lose sight of as people who are living now a couple thousand years after the fact is that the Jewish religion in first century Israel was not a monolithic culture. Right? There were lots of different views on what it meant to be Jewish, right? And we can see some of that just by a quick reading of the New Testament, because we run across several different sects that were within the Jewish community in the first century. You read about Pharisees and Sadducees, right? And they were very different in their outlook of what it meant to be a Jew. Pharisees believed in other worldly realities, and they did have a hope in the resurrection. They believed things like if every single member of the Jewish family kept all 613 laws that are in the Torah for 24 hours, then Messiah would come. And so they were very serious about the way they practiced and observed the laws of the Torah. The Sadducees were more in favor of doing whatever was necessary to keep the Romans from interfering with their Jewish worship. And so they were seen sometimes as compromising some things essential to the faith in order to get along with Rome in Jerusalem, because the Roman presence was felt very, very deeply in first century Jerusalem. And so there was a kind of rift here between the Pharisees and the Sadducees. But there are other types of Jewish sects that are mentioned in the New Testament. There were Essenes, who were even stricter in their observance of the law than the Pharisees, and they had kind of divorced themselves out of the whole thing. Zealots, they were a group of people that were almost directly opposed to the Sadducees. They thought that it was necessary to do everything possible to try to get rid of Rome at the end of the sword with violence. There was the Qumran community. You may be most familiar with the Qumran community. They are the ones that generated the documents that are known today as the Dead Sea Scrolls. There were Baptists. Now, I'm not talking about Southern Baptists here. Baptists in the first century Israel would have been people who followed John the Baptist. And we read about one of those actually in some of Paul's journeys. There was a guy named Apollos who became a very powerful preacher in the early church. And when Paul first met Apollos, he's actually described as a follower of John the Baptist. So these were just some of the ways Judaism was getting expressed in the first century. So there was not just one common core belief of what it meant to be a Jew. So in the midst of all of this tension with Paul before the council, when Paul was done testifying and had gone back to his quarters, Jesus actually appeared to him and told him, "You're going to Rome." Okay, and so from this point forward, Paul is moving toward the city of Rome, the capital city of the Roman Empire. There's a plot to kill Paul, which is kind of interesting if you read up on that. The most interesting thing to me is that there's a whole bunch of Jews who make a pledge that they're not going to eat or drink anything until the Apostle Paul is dead. Well, they never succeeded in killing the Apostle Paul, and I've always wondered, just sort of, in my quieter times, whatever happened to that group of Jews who pledged to kill Paul before they would eat or drink anything? Did they keep their vow? Paul then stands trial before the Roman governor Felix in the city of Caesarea. We've been to Caesarea several times before in the book of Acts, and Luke does that. He'll introduce a place, a person, a thing, and then we'll come back to it several times. We were in Caesarea. We met Cornelius in Caesarea. The deacon Philip made his home in Caesarea, and now Paul is in Caesarea. In the very definition of Rome in the Middle East at the time, and he is having to defend himself before a highly positioned Roman official. Felix gets recalled to Rome. He is replaced by another governor named Festus, where he pretty much makes the same defense and recounts his whole life, his mission and ministry, and what he believes God has called him to do. Right at the end of this whole narrative, Acts 25-26, Festus actually asked the Jewish official Agrippa to come and listen to Paul, and he makes this interesting statement that Paul could have been set free, except he's appealed to the Roman emperor, and so we got to send him to Rome. And so the rest of Acts now, which we'll deal with next time we're together, is Paul's journey to the city of Rome, and how Acts wraps up with Paul in Rome. A couple questions just for your consideration today. Paul makes his claim of citizenship to two different realms. We've read in this part of Acts that Paul claims his Roman citizenship, but Paul also claims his citizenship in the kingdom of heaven. So Paul is a citizen of two realms. He's a citizen of the kingdom of heaven. He's also a Roman citizen. Okay? And sometimes he takes advantage of his Roman citizenship to advance the kingdom of heaven. Question in my mind is, how might Paul's dual citizenship speak to our dual citizenship? Because as American Christians, we are both citizens of the United States of America, and we are citizens of the kingdom of heaven. So how does Paul's dual citizenship speak to our dual citizenship? And one other question for consideration. Paul defended his faith in Jesus before many levels of the Roman government. They were, small level tribunes in the city of Jerusalem, the Roman governor in the city of Caesarea, and eventually he will actually make his defense before Caesar in Rome. Okay? So what does Paul's defense of the gospel say about the importance of our sense of mission and purpose? Thanks for joining in. If you've got any questions or comments, just email the church here. We may not have an answer, but we'll certainly respond. And hope you can tune in next time. Let's close with a word of prayer. Thank you, God, for this time and attention and the ability to gather around your word and think about things that have been said about you and your kingdom long ago that are still very real in our lives today. Keep us safe as we move through this very, very trying time when we can't really be together in person, but we